Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a prequel of a previous lesson from Matthew's 8th chapter. We took it from verse 18 all the way to the end. We're going to cover the material which comes before it. And in the 8th chapter, we witness a hitherto unprecedented ministry of the Messiahs, the ministry of miracles. Now, Mark has him performing miracles. His is an action-oriented gospel. He has him performing miracles as early as the first chapter. In John's account, we have him inaugurating his mortal ministry at the wedding feast of Cana. He doesn't mention the baptism or anything else, but it's not until Luke's 7th chapter that we read of the equivalent scene of the Roman centurion we're going to meet today, although Luke mentions that it was an in Matthew's version, it's directly Joshua and the centurion himself. In Luke's, it's an intermediary. That's just a minor difference of detail. Doesn't mean that either of them, both of them, aren't true. And but what comes before it? He's baptized in the 3rd chapter. He's tempted. He overcomes the temptation in the 4th, and he issues his call out to the original disciples who were fishermen, and he told them, "I'm going to make you fishers of men." Then in the 5th through 7th chapter, we read the most extensive recorded sermon in Scripture, the Sermon of the Mount, the Kingdom Constitution, as he outlines it. And we're just going to briefly review the 7th chapter, which comes before the 8th, in order to establish the momentum in which it bleeds. It opens with a warning against hypocritical judgment, and this expands on what was established in the first 18 verse of the 6th chapter. He highlights and exposes hypocritical religious practices, giving alms, prayer, and fasting in that order, and then he warns against similar hypocrisy. And when we judge others, we are walking in the flesh. To judge, now it's an oversimplification to suggest that there is to be no judgment in the Christian life. We have to have internal discipline, but content to consign the ultimate judgment to God himself. But, we reap what we sow when we judge. We learn in the 2nd verse, "For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with the same measure you use, it shall be measured to you." So that's not to say that we shouldn't judge anything or anyone at all. It's only a word of caution to be careful when you do, because you reap what you sow. And if you are so we don't want to be judgmental. We want to judge when necessity dictates that we judge. We don't want to be judgmental by nature. Because, he says in the 5th verse, "Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and you shall see clearly to remove the splinter out of your brother's eyes." So one of the traps we fall into when we play religious detective is that we are so busy investigating the sins of others that we neglect our own sins. The main sinner you need to take care of is always and only the one in the mirror. Worry about everyone else to the extent that it is responsible, but mainly, there's nothing selfish about tending to your own proximate priority of spiritual welfare. Then, he says, "Ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened to you." So this is a promise. We want to not interpret to the literal extremes that suggest that any selfish whim or desire or fancy is ours on a wish at command. All we have to do is say the word and we'll have it, much as he says the word and the centurion's servant is healed. But there's but it's really the Father, the 11th verse, if you then, being wicked, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more shall your Father who is in the heavens give what is good to those who ask him? So he is good. He knows what's best for us. He knows us better than ourselves. He knows what we want, need, and desire, and he's not going to let the desires get in the way of our needs. So when we petition him, we are praying to the best being for our very best. And then there's the golden rule, "Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets," 12th verse. And so that is what renders Christianity distinct from every other religion is they say, do not do what you would not want to do. It's far more challenging and rare to do the positive principle of the same coin, and to extend graces and benefits and blessings where they are needed, rather to refrain than inflicting evil on someone just because you can. Then he speaks of the path of salvation. It is a narrow way, and the hell to death and damnation in hell is broad and destructive. The path to salvation is narrow, and that offends a lot of people because they reject the idea that there can be only one way to the Father, but he makes it quite clear that he is the only way. I am the Son of God. I die on the cross. There's no other way to heaven. And that offends a lot of people, but, they're weak and worthless, so who cares what they think. Then there's a word of caution against false prophets, and the fruit is the ultimate measure and assessment. So we have to judge the teachings we hear and the teachers who speak them to connect it to the earliest theme of this chapter. And the fruit, so, if their teachings will be reflective because thought shapes action and conduct, so you will know them by their fruit. And he says this in the 15th and the 20th verse. And then he says just exactly how narrow the way to salvation is. He tells them flat out, not everyone who says to me, Master, Master, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who is doing the will of my Father in the heavens. So profession is no substitute for practice. There's a difference between professing Christians and the possessing Christians. The possession Christians are so on fire by the Spirit that he lives and abides in them, and they just cannot get enough of preaching, always using words only when necessary. So lip service, he indicts the hypocritical religious practitioners who who give long public prayers just to be noticed, just to be looked upon, and it's ultimately not about Elohim when you do that. But in the same way, doing the will of the Father, it's not enough that we do the spiritual disciplines. We have to do them according to his will and his way, his designs, his function, and his purposes. Then he tells them flat, he's going to say, I never knew you. Even those who profit and cast out demons, perform exorcisms, and do mighty signs and wonders, he's going to tell them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. So our profession and even our works, there is no work-based salvation. We cannot rest our case at the eternal judgment, which we all have to prepare for and cultivate, on our works or our profession. We have to admit that we are bankrupt in ourselves and lean on the only one who is sufficient to secure our salvation. And then he breaks into a literary device, which is at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And it's interesting because what we witness, at least certainly in Matthew, is that the explicit declarations, the doctrines, and unveiled simplicity are no longer presented as they once were in the Sermon on the Mount. By the time the opposition mounts against him, he increasingly relies on parables, and the first one is given here. The one who does the word and obeys it, and blessed is he who hears the word and obeys it, is likened to a man who built his house on a rock that's a sturdy foundation, that's one that will last, that is physically superior alternative to the sand, which is likened to the one who hears the word and does not obey it. So everyone's heard the word in the United States of America at least one point or another. They are without excuse, but that does not mean that if they are without excuse, that means all of us are without excuse. And so we want to build ourselves on the sturdy structure with him as the cornerstone, the master in our lives. And, the outcomes for a house built on the sand and built on the rock are graphically presented in the context of a storm, which... And then we read that Yahshua had ended these words, and the people were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one possessing authority and not as the scribes. So the scribes, they could reference authority. They got their authority secondhand through, and he had no authority. He was not formally educated in the rabbinical schools, but he spoke with authority, that elusive quality that all of the scribes implicitly lacked. And they were astonished and marveled. And we also read a similar word in Yahshua's response to the faith of the centurion. We've referenced him enough, but before that, there's actually... So of the 10 miracles which break out in the 8th and 9th chapter, we're going to cover 4 of them today, and the next one comes in the calming of the storm, and the lesson that we already covered from this chapter, and also the expulsion of a man who was by the Gadarenes. It was two men in Matthew's account. In Matthew's and Luke's, it's only one, but they're not all exactly the same geographical location, but much of the story is similar, and that is a miracle in itself. And then in the 9th, we read the rest of the 10. So opening verse, 8th chapter, lesson itself. And when he came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. The mountain would have been the sermon on which the Sermon on the Mount, on which the Sermon on the Mount was delivered. There are credible historical estimations, but alas, they're ultimately and only speculation. The one thing we do know is that we don't know what the mount is. We know it was on a hill, and people liked what they said. They were drawing to him. They were gathering around him. He had no trouble attracting crowds, but he often resorts to crowd winnowing. So he wasn't motivated by acclaim or publicity or celebrity or prestige. When the crowds got too big, he would lay down the demands of discipleship to cut the winnow from the shaft. And a leper came and bowed before him, saying, Master, if you are able to make me clean. So lepers were the outcast and exiles of the ancient community. That this man was he's down the mountain, so he's not exactly in human society, but lepers would have been forbidden entrance into the camp of Israel in the covenant community. And he says he knows he has the power. This is an expression of faith, a concrete one at that. You are able to make me clean, but only if you want to. So he approaches him with due deference. He is not ashamed. Now, a leper, by sheer contagion, would not be permitted into crowds, but the leper will be a leper no more, because Yahshua is not only able, but he's willing to accommodate his humble request. And stretching out his hand, Yahshua touched him, saying, I will it, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. So just like that, in the blink of an eye, a twinkling of the eye, that's all it takes. He holds out his hand, touches him, and tells him the same thing. I will it, be cleansed. And just like that, the leprosy is gone totally, finally, and irrevocably. And the word immediacy stresses the just the velocity at which he left him. But by his touch and by his word, he can heal. But with the centurion who we're going to meet, it's by his word. He doesn't even see the man that he heals. So we don't want to limit what he can and cannot do. And Yahshua said to him, See, mention it to no one, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a witness to them. So the first thing we read of in his instruction is that he imposes a prohibition of evangelizing about the miracle that had happened. He didn't want him spreading the news, such as he does in the to the demon-possessed man, possessed by a whole legion of demons. He tells him to go in. So there are times when it is appropriate for him to command this prohibition of evangelical incentive, and other times when he gives the loosen up. And there's no middle ground. Yes means yes and no means no. But he wants him to go through the Jewish requirements of presenting oneself to the priest. They got their certificate of cleanliness on priestly examination. And there was a gift that Moses had commanded. This would have been well known to lepers, certainly, because they ached for return and restoration of the community. So they would have known fully well. It's probably in the book of Leviticus somewhere. And he was to witness to them, not the whole world, but just to these priests, so they can know that there's someone who is doing things with authority that is not authorized by them. And when Yahshua had entered Capernaum, a captain went up to him, appealing to him. Capernaum, this is a different scene. They are they are just coming down the mountain, and the thing that he does, the highlight of his activity there, is he instantly cleanses a leper. That's the likes of which we have not yet read. The miraculous manifestation of his power is something hitherto unprecedented in Matthew. Of course, his virgin birth was a miracle in itself, and it also ultimately depends on how liberally one defines the word miracle. But to return to the text itself, Capernaum was the city in Galilee. It was by this lake of Galilee. It was his center of ministerial operations, and though he had performed great signs and wonders there, he ultimately pronounces it cursed because they had rejected him collectively as a town. So even though he was doing all these great things from their city and in their city, he was ultimately rejected by them, and he pronounced cursing on them, that saying that they're going to envy the denizens of Sodom and Gomorrah with the judgment which awaits you. And he's appealing to him, saying, Master, my servant is lying in the house paralyzed, grievously tortured. So this centurion, ultimate thing we should have established before reading that is captain is more familiar translated as centurion. This would have been a Roman infantry commander of some 100 people. Century means 100. That means 100 men under his command and control. So therein we learn that he is accustomed to obeying and giving orders. So he has an understanding of his own line of works, exchange of authority and transfer, which he applies to his. He recognizes that he, like the people who were on the sermon, the mount who were there, they were teaching them as one having authority. So he recognizes the same authority in him. And Yahshua said to him, I shall come and heal him. So by come, we understand it to be physical walking to his location, wherever he was willing to do it. He was willing to walk the extra mile. And earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, he tells us that if a Roman centurion commands you to carry his backpack, the average Roman backpack would have weighed 63 pounds, and the Romans had license to command their subject people to carry it for a mile. He said, take it 2, go the extra mile. So we have to have the same mentality. It wasn't convenient for him to come, but it ultimately was more convenient to heal him on the spot, which is what he did right then and there in response to faith. And the centurion answering said, Master, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only say a word, and my servant shall be healed. So Jews, ordinary, faithful, pious Jews, wouldn't step foot in the Gentile house. We read of in John's 18th chapter that they were literally betraying and to be crucified and executing the Messiah of prophecy, and they were more concerned about stepping foot in Pontius Pilate's house. But perhaps this man, that he considered himself unworthy, was his own sense of guilt and sin and shame. This is an awareness. Once you have an awareness in the presence of divinity, there's a qualitative chasm which exists between us and him. So he knew he was a sinner. You know, he had manners, and the centurions, interestingly enough, that by patriotic Jews would have been seen as instruments of oppression, but every centurion spoken of in the Gospels and in the book of Acts is positive, praiseworthy qualities. And so this man was humble, you know, he was deferential, he was sincere, he cared for the servant who was lying and waiting at death's door. He's paralyzed, and it's torturing him, it's literally killing him, it's eating him alive as I speak. But all you have to do is say the word. You don't even have to come, because your word has a power that travels. I recognize your authority to heal him. For I too am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. So he's using the mentality from his own line of work. The Roman military would have been just as any military, its operational impetus comes from authority. You have to have men at the top, few men telling many men what to do, or else the army's not going to move or function, or it's going to cease to exist if everyone's going their own way and doing their own thing on the battlefield especially. That's why they are trained and they are under authority. So he recognizes that his command and his control over the demons of sickness and paralysis and living death are more powerful than his command and his control of his infantry units, which as a centurion he would have been accustomed to commanding. And when Yahshua heard, he marveled and said to those who followed, Truly I say to you that not even in Israel have I found such great faith. Now that's the first of 3 times that we read that Yahshua was amazed. He usually brings the amazement, but in at least three instances in the gospel, in Luke's parallel account, we read that he is amazed by the centurion's faith, marveled in this translation, and in Mark's account, when he's in his own native town of Nazareth, and he was amazed at their lack of belief. So, the faith is what it takes to amaze him, and this man certainly had an amazing amount of faith to sufficiently impress him to exalt him as an exemplar to the Jewish people as a model of faith. And Yahshua heard, and not even in Israel has I found such great faith. So, in other words, the Gentiles are perfectly capable of exceeding the Jews, who had all the spiritual blessings, benefits, and privileges that the Gentiles lacked. This man had greater faith than anyone else in the land of Israel. He had never seen anything like it, and he freely acknowledges it. And I say to you that many shall come from the east and the west, and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So from the north to the south, the east to the west, four corners of the earth, that is... Now earlier we mentioned that the path to salvation is narrow, but not in an exclusive sense to which only the Jews could inherit that blessed abode. He says the plan and path of salvation is open and available to everyone, but you have to come on my terms. And whether you're from the east or the west or the north or the south, if you meet my terms, then you will, have intimate access to the patriarchs of the Jewish faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And read of something similar in Luke's 11th chapter. But the sons of the kingdom shall be cast into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So Satan has a kingdom too. His control over his kingdom is almost as tight and almost as exact. He is not an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent being, but he is as close as able. He does have 50 million demons at his disposal, and he has many human minions who are going to meet him in his end, and it's going to be outer darkness, nothing to look at, no one to be with, nothing to see, and it's going to be a place of misery and torment, weeping and gnashing of teeth. Just think, what instance do you gnash of teeth? That's a frightening spectacle to visually behold in animals or humans or anyone else. And Yahshua said to the centurion, Go, and as you have believed, so let it be done to you. And his servant was healed that hour. So belief is the key which access the miraculous. With faith, we can move mountains. We can say to this mountain, go be moved in the sea, we are elsewhere told. And this, his word, if we do our deeds in the name of him and with sincerity, then we can unleash and unlock a truly miraculous potential. And but as we witness also the fulfillment of the promise that we read in the 7th verse, ask and it shall be given to you. So he asked and he received the response to his request. It was a righteous request, so it was granted, and his servant was healed that hour. So by the time he would have got back to his home, the servant would have had a new lease on life. He would have been standing, no longer paralyzed, no longer on death's door. And when Yahshua had come into the house of Peter, he saw his wife's mother laying sick with inflammation. So we earlier mentioned that Mark's action-oriented gospel opens with him performing miracles even before he's preaching. In fact, we don't read of the preaching in Mark's gospel until the 4th chapter, and not a whole lot outside of that chapter, the contents of his teaching and preaching. But the same situation as described in there, Peter's mother-in-law is sick with inflammation. Inflammation can mean one of several things, but we just, keep it realistic in your mind as to what it could be and what it could not be. And he touched her hand, and the inflammation left her, and she arose and served them. So she had the righteous response to being healed. She arose and served them. She got back to her duties as hostess as soon as giving the new lease on life. She was laying sick. She was unable to move, motion, operate, live, function. But through his touch, the simple touch, the power of the inflammation is eliminated and expelled indefinitely. And so she rises with the new lease on life, and she gets right to it. She served them. That's a model of what we are to do. We can read of a similar parallel principle in Luke's 17th chapter. The Samaritan, who was one of the 10 who was healed, he alone returned to thank Yahshua for giving him a new lease on life. And he said, where are all the others? So this Peter's mother-in-law had the same mindset as the Samaritan who was healed like from leprosy, as was the man in the second and through fourth verses. And when evening had come, they brought him to many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with the word, and healed all who were sick. So this could count as the fourth miracle, but it's more than one miracle. It's just it's just a mass of miracles. There are many, there are plural, but he cast out all the spirits with the word, so his word is the power before which no demon or sickness can stand. And there's healing in his words. And when you are sick, when you are spiritually sick, when you are physically sick, you can be healed, you can be made whole, you can be made right, you can be given life through his word. So his word, it not only gives us life, but gives that life meaning. And so, there's no number of demons possessing one person, or even 100 people. We don't know how many were there, but it could have been in the 3 digits. And, just like that, they were gone. The demons were. That it might be filled what was spoken of by Isaiah the prophet, saying, He himself took our weaknesses and bore our sicknesses. So Matthew is writing, remember, to a primarily Jewish audience, so he quotes the Old Testament more frequently than any other gospel author, and this is probably from the Greek Septuagint. It either aligns with Isaiah 53:4 or 55. It's not going to be identical in the translation of the Hebrew but the idea in that chapter is that he is our vicarious atonement, and he takes on our weaknesses, and he bears our penalty, bore our sicknesses. He was literally sick and beaten to senseless from sin. And but here in the immediate context, it's a reference to his healing ministry. So a lot can be applied in this. This is certainly a skilled exegesis that Matthew can be credited through the power of the Ruach Kodesh to repeat himself, to tie this Old Testament prophecy to something he had seen, witnessed, it's actually not until the 9th chapter that Matthew is called. So, and everything in his gospel is generally, though not always, chronologically presented. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.